Hello, this is Paranormal Girl, and today I'm going to talk about Project Blue Book and the famous sighting of the UFO fleet over Washington in 1952. Now the first series of Project Blue Book is finished, and season 2 is in production now as we speak. They finished famously with that sighting in Washington in 1952 with that fleet of UFOs. So let's take a look at the real stories behind this. When UFOs buzzed the White House and the Air Force blamed the weather. When a slew of saucer-like sightings were reported over Washington, D.C. in 1952, the Air Force blocked its own investigator from checking them out. And let's see why. So when a rush of strange sightings was reported over the skies in Washington, D.C. that summer, the press and the public demanded answers. Were these unexplained radar blips, crafts, or in some cases outran jets, part of a nuclear-armed Soviet invasion, which was a very real threat during that day? And they always blame the Russians for anything unusual that happened, especially if it was UFOs that were sighted. But in this instance, this wasn't just seen by a handful of people. This was seen by Air Force personnel. This was seen by the public, police force, just about everyone that day. And it's a very famous case. But let's go back to its roots. It all started in 1947 when a search and rescue pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported 9 saucer-like things flying like geese in a diagonal chain-like line at speeds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour near Mount Rainier in Washington state. Within weeks, flying saucer sightings had been reported in 40 other states. I will be doing a video on the famous Roswell case after this video. In the name of national security, Air Force General Nathan Twining launched Project Sign, originally named Project Saucer, in 1948, the first official military intelligence program to collect information on UFO sightings. Its investigators dismissed the vast majority as hoaxes or misidentifications of known aircraft or natural phenomena. But a few cases remained unexplained, as always. And they know the truth. And what are they doing? They're hiding it from the public. By 1952, the UFO investigation unit was called Project Blue Book, led by Captain Edward Ruppelt at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Ruppelt and his team would probably have continued to investigate a couple of dozen sightings a month, if not for the April 1952 issue of Life magazine. Just above its knockout cover shot of Marilyn Monroe ran an equally eye-catching headline, "There is a case of interplanetary saucers." The article was written with Ruppelt's full cooperation and explained the Air Force's national security interests in UFOs, and made for a convincing case. Through the colourful retelling of 10 unexplained UFO incidences, these unidentified objects were extraterrestrial in origin. As one rocket scientist working on secret projects for the USA told Life, "I'm completely convinced that they have an out-of-world basis." According to a Washington Post, a number of UFO sightings reported by the Air Force jumped more than sixfold from 23rd of March 1952, from 23 in March of 1952 to 148 in June. By July, the precise conditions were in place for a wildfire of UFO mania. Widespread Cold War anxiety, and this again was blamed on the Russians, mainstream press coverage of unexplained UFO incidences, and a healthy dose of midsummer madness. All that was needed was a spark. So first of all, they thought this thing was a radar blip buzzing over the White House. So let's have a little read about what they actually did see. Shortly before midnight on Saturday, July 19th, 1952, Air Traffic Controller Edward Nugent of Washington National Airport spotted 7 slow-moving objects on his radar screen, far from any known civilian or military flight path. He called over his superior and joked about a fleet of flying saucers. At this time, 2 more air traffic controllers at National spotted a strange bright light hovering in the distance, then suddenly zipped away at an incredible speed. At nearby Andrews Air Force Base, radar operators were getting the same unidentified blips, slow and clustered at first, then racing away at speeds exceeding 7,000 miles an hour. Looking out of his tower window, one of Andrews' controllers saw what he described as an orange ball of fire trailing a tail. Now, at this point, you'd think it would be a comet. But, I mean, these men were trained at spotting things that were comets in the sky, for instance. Because that was what their job was. They were trained to see if there was any danger in the skies for the known flights. A commercial pilot cruising over the Virginia and Washington, D.C. area reported 6 streaking bright lights, like falling stars without tails. And again, pilots are trained to spot various objects in the sky. So if anyone would know, they would. When radar operators at National watch the objects buzz past the White House and Capitol building, the UFO jokes stopped. 2 F-94 interceptor jets were scrambled, but each time they approached the locations appearing on the radar screens, the mysterious blips would disappear. By dawn of July 20th, the objects were gone. I tried to make contact with the bogies. Nobody bothered to tell Ruppelt, the Air Force Base's lead Project Blue Book investigator, about the sightings. He found out a few days later when he flew into Washington, D.C. and read news reports. Ruppelt tried to get out of the National and Andrews to interview radar operators and air traffic controllers, but was denied a government-issue car and even cab fare. Frustrated, he flew back to Ohio with nothing. The very next Saturday, the UFOs were back over the nation's capital. Again, Ruppelt found out through a phone call from a reporter and immediately called on 2 Air Force colleagues to check out the situation at National. The same radar blips were back, and radar operators wondered out loud if the dozen or so objects on the screens couldn't be caused by a temperature inversion, as they famously said on the series, a common phenomenon in the DC hot, muggy summer months. Now, a temperature inversion occurs when a layer of warm air forms in the low atmosphere, trapping cooler air beneath. Radar signals can bounce off this layer at shallow angles and mistakenly show near-ground objects as appearing in the sky. Ruppelt's Air Force colleagues, however, were convinced that the objects on the radar screen weren't mirages, but solid aircraft. To be safe, 2 more F-94 jets were scrambled to chase down the unidentified targets appearing on radar screens at both National and Andrews. A game of high-speed whack-a-mole ensued, where the jets would race to a location targeted by radar, only for the blips to vanish. Finally, one of the jet pilots caught sight of a bright light in the distance and gave chase. He said, "I tried to make contact with the bogies below 1,000 feet. The pilot later told reporters. I saw several bright lights. I was at maximum speed, but even then I had no closing speed. I ceased chasing them because I saw no chance of overtaking them." So, averting a mass panic with a disputed theory, The next day, the newspaper headlines across America screamed, "Saucers swarm over Capitol," and "Jets chase DC sky ghosts." The publicity and public panic over the sightings was so great that President Harry Truman himself asked aides to get answers. When they called Ruppelt, he said it could have been caused by a temperature inversion, but more investigations were needed to fully explain both the radar images and credible eyewitness accounts. And again, how could they possibly say that this was a temperature inversion when so many witnesses came forward and said what they actually saw? But before such an in-depth investigation could take place, the Air Force called the press conference, the longest such news event since World War II. The Air Force brass had decided, without consulting Ruppelt or the Project Blue Book team, that the best response to the sightings was to feed the press and the public an easy-to-swallow explanation. How many times have they done that to us? One quite recently, actually. We won't go there. Dodging specific questions about what pilots and radar operators had seen in the skies over the Capitol, Major General John Samford came back again, and again to the temperature inversion theory. Never mind that Ruppelt had since come to the opposite conclusion. The investigators had ruled out the inversion, says Alexandro Rojas, editor of the UFO news site Open Minds. They had examined that situation. The radar operators said inversions happen. We know what inversions look like. This is not an inversion. This is not the same thing at all. There's your answer. To Ruppelt's disappointment, the Air Force's press conference worked exactly as planned. The papers reported the temperature inversion story, and the public largely seemed to accept it. In his 1956 book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, Ruppelt reports that after the press conference, UFO sightings dropped from 50 a day to 10. Skeptics, however, weren't satisfied with the government's response. Many accused Air Force and Project Blue Book investigators of devious behaviours and secret knowledge. It wasn't until Project Blue Book documents were made public when and what UFO sleuths could see the closest thing to a government cover-up of UFO sightings in the nation's capital was actually a conspiracy of ignorance. A Washington UFO flap perfectly illustrates the real government cover-up, says Nick Pope, a UFO journalist who used to run a UFO investigations unit for the British Ministry of Defence. It's not a situation where the authorities conspired to keep some terrible truth about UFOs from the people, but rather the government doing its best to keep people from realising they didn't have all the answers. So let's take a look at a news article that actually happened on the day. Saucers over Washington, D.C. Harry G. Barnes, Senior Air Route Traffic Controller for the Civil Aeronautics Administration, was in charge of the National Airport Washington, D.C. ART Control Center on the 9th of July 19th, 1952. Briefly, he states in a newspaper article, "Our job is to constantly monitor the skies around the nation's capital with the electronic eye of radar." Shortly after midnight on that date, 7 pips suddenly appeared on the control center scope. Ed Nugent, Jim Copeland, and Jim Richley, all experienced radar controllers, and they checked the observations. The airport control tower radar operators verified the same sighting. They were over the restricted area of Washington, including the White House and the Capitol. So let's now take a look at another document I have found, and it's actually the CIA agency's own documentation of what occurred. I will leave a link in the description. It makes for a very, very good reading. It has now been released. It was released in 2001 for the public to view. Again, it makes for a very interesting read. It's Flying Saucers UFO Reports. And again, I'll leave the link in the description. Read it. It's very, very interesting. But I'll read a quick excerpt here from here about the actual event that happened. A concise, convincing and provocative report on saucers was submitted to Project Blue Book in 1954 by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hedrick, USAFR senior pilot, and later confirmed by letter in a brief description for NICAP, which reports in it UFO the evidence. In the same outline, the colonel presented number 1, saucers exist, and he says, I saw 2. Number 2, they were intelligently controlled or operated, evasive tactics, formation flight, and hovering flight. Number 3, they are not propelled on any thermodynamic principle. No contrails while jet intercept aircraft left heavy ones. Number 4, they are mechanisms rather than hallucinations, optical illusions, natural phenomenon. The colonel's evaluation. Number 5, they are not US secret weapons, for if they were, many contracts I am now working on would be dropped. Also, they would not fly outside military test reservations. Number 6, they are not Russian for similar reasons. Russians have complained about their flying over their borders. They would not risk malfunction over our territory. Number 7, I presume they are extraterrestrial. Number 8, provided they are, interstellar navigation would likely present little more complication than navigation within our solar system. Therefore, discussion on whether or not planets in the solar system are capable of supporting life is not material. Number 9, judging from all evidence I have read, personal contact has not yet been established either on the ground or by the radio transmission. It makes sense that a sizable number of UFO reports would come from the men who make their living in the skies and who are conversant with the types of curious lights and shapes with which they may come into contact. Airline pilots have been the source of some of the most informative reports that are on record with the Air Force from time Sorry about that. So I'll read that again. Airline pilots have been the source of some of the most informative reports that are on record with the Air Force from the time of its initial organized filing. First, with Project Sign, then Project Grudge, and finally Project Blue Book. But in the spring of 1950, even this usually calm branch of the service was jolted by a number of quality reports from pilots that began to pour in. In 3 months, starting from April, airline crews had accounted for 35 reports of UFOs, and Captain Eddie Rickbacker, in an interview quoted in the UFO Evidence, page 33, said flying saucers are real. Too many good men have seen them that don't have hallucinations. It wasn't until 1952, however, that the very Capitol itself was rocked. That was the famous sighting over Washington, D.C. Sightings that hit the headlines with interceptors chase flying saucers over Washington, D.C. before Air Force intelligence even knew about it. There had been forewarning sightings near Quantico and Newport News, another at Langley Air Force Base, and another 60 miles southwest of Washington, all within a few nights of each other in mid-July. But on July 19th, it was Washington, D.C. on the nose that picked up radar on National Airport and at Andrews and reported was 8 unidentified targets near Andrews AFB accelerating too rapidly to be planes. Airline pilots were also sighting the unknown lights that slowed, then spurted ahead with fantastic speed. Within 40 minutes, one pilot spotted 6. The granddaddy of them all was a huge, fiery orange sphere that hung over the Andrews radio range station. That many crack radar experts and veteran pilots couldn't be kissed off. They had seen something, and it fell to Edward Ruppelt, then the head of Project Blue Book, to decide what explanation the Air Force would release to the press. A week later, Washington had its second visit. This time the objects were spread in an arc around the nation's capital, and jets were being vetoed out to see what they were. The objects would shoot off before the jets could get anywhere near them. It wasn't easy for nerve-wracked air intelligence to fend off the public excitement and queries engendered by such headlines as "Fiery objects outrun jets over Capitol." One of the most sympathetic chapters in Ruppelt's excellent report on unidentified objects deals with the almost insoluble problem that confronted ATIC during that week. It was a chance remark by an ATIC official suggesting that the radar target might have been caused by, there we go, temperature inversions. According to Ruppelt's account, that eventually got the press off their backs and quieted a distressed nation with the headline, "Air Force debunks saucers as just natural phenomenon." Although Mr. Ruppelt acknowledged that the twin sightings were still carried as unknowns, yes, one does find skeptics and outright non-believers among the air pilots of all nations, but one finds solid converts to the UFO legions, one of whom, Air Chief Marshal Lord Dowding, RAF of England, was quoted in a UFO activity report released in 1965 by NICAP saying, "I am convinced that these objects do exist and they are not manufactured by any nation on earth, so therefore they must come from some extraterrestrial source." And I will also finish off by saying even today there are still UFO sightings over Washington now as we speak. And I found a report in September 11th, 2018, sequential rotating orange fireballs head south and turn east. I'll blow this up for you as well to see. And it reads, "I went outside to walk my dog, looked north in the sky and saw an orange fireball heading south towards my location. The closer it got to me, it looked like the ball was rotating and really on fire. I don't know what it was, but it is sad that I didn't get to show my neighbour. Then at a slow and steady rate of speed, it suddenly turned and headed east towards the mountains. About 3 minutes later, another one came into view and seemed to be an identical flight pattern. Then another one, 3 in total came from the north, heading south. Then at Grand Mound, turned and went east. I was able to holler up to the neighbour, and she didn't know what it was either. It was awesome." There's a map of where they saw it. And this was located in Rochester, Washington. Like I said, even today, Washington is still getting UFO sightings, and very much more is happening that the press do not want us to know about. Not really. And the government, as I said before, they are covering up. Now, they did say Project Blue Book closed down, But I wonder, is it still working behind closed doors? I think they are. But obviously they go by a different name now these days. I wonder what it's called now. Let me know in the comments below if you have seen a UFO yourself. It would be very interesting to see what your sightings have been.